So as a follow-up to my last video about getting ASP.NET Core installed on Cloud 9, I thought I'd do this video about getting into the Framework Core working with ASP.NET Core on Cloud 9. So I've already done some of the prerequisite work. I've installed I've installed the packages for .NET Core and also for Yeoman. If you want to see how that's done, check out the previous video. So I've already got .NET on here and I've already got Yeoman, so I can run the ASP.NET generator with Yo ASP.NET, and this is going to ask me what kind of application I want to create. So what I want to do here is I want to create a web application basic, and this one without membership and authorization. And the reason for this is because the web application here, it will create one with membership and authorization, which will include into the framework already, and I want to start from scratch. So I'll hit enter, I'll choose Bootstrap, and I'm going to call this Conference Barrel. And the reason why I call this Conference Barrel is because this is kind of my standard demo app now, where it's a catalog of conferences. This is going to be a very extremely simple version of it. But at any rate, so it's created my Conference Barrel application and generated some files. And the first thing we need to do is we need to go into the project.json and add the dependencies for the Entity Framework. Now I'm not going to type all this stuff out. I've already got this over here in a file of snippets. So I'll just copy this first one, which has, and actually we're not going to need relational. Actually I need these three. So what this is these are the Entity Framework core dependencies for SQLite, and this is going to go in project.json under the dependencies. Just clean that up a little bit. And then there's one that needs to go under tools as well, and that's this Entity Framework core.tools. Alright, and so now I can get rid of the snippets file. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my terminal. I'm going to cd into Conference Barrel, and now what I'll do is I'll run my .NET restore to get all of the packages, and I'll speed this up. With that done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a models folder. And convention dictates that we have a folder for the models, and inside of there I'm going to create a couple of classes. The first one is going to be for a conference, and then I'll open it up over here, and I'm going to put this inside of a namespace which will be conference barrel.models, and then I'm going to create a public class called conference. I'm going to give some properties. The first property is going to be an int, and that'll be the ID of the conference. And then the second one will be a name. And then finally, going to take a decimal, and that'll be the ticket price. And that'll work now for a conference model. I want to have another model because conferences always have sessions. So I'll create a session class as well. Open it. Put it in this same namespace. Create a class for session. Give it an ID. And also it's going to get a title. And then also I'm going to create a foreign key and navigation property that will refer back to the conference to which this session belongs. So we're going to have an int that will be a conference ID, and we're going to have a conference that will be called conference, and that'll have a getter and setter. So now what we can do is we can go back over to the conference and add a list of session that will be sessions, and this will be all of the sessions that belong to this conference. And also going to have to go up here and include the system.generic collections.generic namespace. Okay, so with that done, we now need to create an application DB context to talk between the objects and the database itself. So I'll create another new file. I'm going to call this application DB context. I'll open it up, and the first thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to bring in the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core namespace, and I'll put this again in the Conference Barrel namespace, Conference Barrel Models namespace rather, and I'll create the public class of application DB context. And what this will do is this will derive from DB context, which is in the Microsoft Entity Framework Core namespace. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two public properties of data set. One will be a DB set. One will be a DB set of conference, and DB set is also in the Microsoft.Entity Core Framework namespace. And this will be called conferences. Give it a getter and a setter, and then we'll create another one called sessions, and give it a getter and a setter. And now what we need to do is going to override a method in from DB context called onConfiguring, and this takes a DB context options builder instance. With Entity Framework Core, all of the configuration is done in code, so that's why we have to go through this exercise. And all I have to do in here is tell the options builder that we're going to be using SQLite. SQLite is something, so generally if you're on Visual Studio in Windows, then what you would use, you would use SQL Server Local DB. That doesn't exist, at least not yet, on Linux. So we're going to use SQLite, which is a lightweight file-based database, and all we have to do here is simply to give it a file name. Spell this correctly. Alright, so what this is going to do is this is going to create this file confbarrel.db, and it's actually going to create it relative to the compiled assemblies for this web application. So to get this, so the next thing we need to do is go back over to the terminal, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this command .NET EF migrations add, and that needs to be EF. What this is going to do is this is going to set up migrations. Now, if you were in Visual Studio, you would have gone to the PowerShell terminal, and then you would have run enable migrations. Instead, what we're going to do is this is how we're going to do it with .NET Core and Entity Framework Core. We're going to use the .NET command line interface, and then what I need to do is give this a name, and I'll just call it initial. And let's see here. Oh, it looks like I have that should be options context options builder rather. Okay. Let's go back over here and try this again. This is one nice thing about using Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio is you're going to get you're going to get IntelliSense and code completion that will help prevent those types of mistakes. So it worked this time. So now what I need to do is I need to apply that migration with .NET EF database, not migration, but rather update. Alright, and here it says that it applied the migration. Now you'll notice over here there's a migrations folder, and this has a migration in it that creates the tables for the up method and drops them if you decide to roll back this migration. Alright, so much for that. Now, like I said, this is being stored in a SQLite database, and that SQLite database can be found in this bin debug netcore app 1.0 directory here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new terminal, and I'm going to go to that directory. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the SQLite 3 command line tool, which is what you can use to inspect SQLite files, conf_db, and I'm going to run this .tables command, and you'll see that we indeed do have a sessions table and a conferences table, one for each of the DB sets in our application DB context class, and then also some history information. Alright, but there's no data in there, so let's take care of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the home controller, and what I'm going to do, this is going to be kind of contrived because I don't want to go through all the trouble of going through and making a form. If you've used MVC or ASP.NET in the past, you know how to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a public method here, an action method. Notice that they return an iAction result as opposed to an action result. I'm going to call it create conference, and what's going to happen is create conference will automatically generate a conference for us, and then what it'll do is it'll redirect to another action that will display, that will pull that conference out of the database and then display it. So, but first of all, what we have to have an application DB context to pull these things from. So private application DB context ctx equals new application DB context, and this is in the conference barrel models namespace. Alright, now we can go down here and create the conference, and this works pretty much like it did in previous versions of Entity Framework. So I'll create a conference and say it's going to be a new conference, and I'll give this a name of first conference, and I'll give it a ticket price of $250. And that's, put that capital M, that's what tells C# that this is a decimal value as opposed to a double. And then on the context, I'll go to context conferences, I'll add the conference, and then I will save the changes. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to add some sessions. So I'm going to get a list of session titles here, and I'm just going to create a new list of strings, and I believe, yeah, system.collections.generic is already imported. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a couple here. So we'll create one on .NET Core, we'll create one on ASP.NET Core, and also create one on Entity Framework Core. Alright, and then we'll iterate over those. So for each var title in session titles, what I'll do is I'll create a session, and that'll be a new session. Give the title, and the conference that it belongs to will be the conference that we just created. And then what we will do is we'll add the session to the context. And then save the changes. And now what I want to do is from this I will return a redirect to action, and I'm going to have a view conference action, which I will create down here. And this will also return an iAction result. We'll call it view conference. And then what this is going to do is this is going to get the conference out of the, or actually what it's going to do is going to get just the first conference out of the database, and then it's going to return that conference in the view. Now, there's a problem here. If we run this now and then in the view try to access the sessions property of this conference, it's going to come back null because we're not eager loading the sessions that belong to the conference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this include method, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide it a lambda expression that says which property of the conferences to eager load. So I'll do that with this lambda expression, just telling it c.sessions is what I want to load. Now this method here is part of the entity framework, so I'll have to add the using statement for entity framework core up here. And I believe that is all for this. Now what I need to do is I need to create a view. So in the home I will create a new file. I will call it view conference.cshtml. Open it up. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy from an existing view, so I want to type so much. Let's try that again. There we go. And so I'll just say for the title, conferences, I'll get rid of that. For this here, I'll just say dot model, put the title of the conference, and the model is going to be of, you need to put my model directive up here, and it's going to be of type conference barrel dot models dot conference. And so then down here what I could do is I could put a list that is all of the sessions. So for each var session in model.sessions, and then I'll just create a list item here and say session.title, and that model.title is wrong. It needs to be model.name. Alright, and finally one more change that needs to be made is I need to go into program.cs, since we're running on Cloud 9, and tell it to use an address and port that Cloud 9 allows. So the use URLs, HTTP, we're going to listen on all addresses, and on port 8080, which Cloud 9 will map to port 80. Alright, with that, let's see if I made any typos. Run a .NET build. And let's see here. So home controller 65. I left out the equals. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, great. And now I should be able to do a .NET run. Okay, it is now listening. So now what I can do is the Name of this workspace is EF Core Demo. So I'm going to go to efcoredemo.binarychef, which is the account name for on Cloud9, c9users.io. The home page comes up, and I should be able to go to home/create conference. And there we go. It redirected to view conference, and we can see the title of the conference here, the name of the conference here, and then the title of each of the sessions down here. Let's go back over here to this terminal, and let's take a look at that database again. Because what I'm going to do now is the same tables are in there as before, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a select star from conferences, and you'll see the conference that we entered, and I'll also do a select star from sessions, and you'll see the sessions. So this is again a way to get up and running very quickly. If you want to get the real developer, the full developer experience, you'll want to use Visual Studio, or if you're not on Windows, Visual Studio Code. But other than that, this is a really good way, like I said before, to experiment with really no risk outside of your time, experimenting with ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate likes and or feedback, or share it on Twitter or something like that. Thanks for watching.